Well, good afternoon and welcome to our Unchaining Modern Slavery webinar series. We're delighted to have you join us. We're going to kick off in about 1 more minute. We just want to give a bit more time for people to join us as they're ending their other meetings or perhaps having lunch, wherever they are today. So yeah, we'll be starting in another minute. Well, welcome to our Unchaining Modern Slavery series. This is our first webinar for 2022, and I reflect back on 2021 and just think of all the amazing conversations I had to help the Australian business community to advance in the way they're addressing modern slavery and monitoring and reporting modern slavery risks. And in a sense, yes, complying with the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, but also leading beyond compliance. My name is Dr. Stephen Morse. I'm the founder and director of Unchained Solutions. And Unchained inspires Australian organisations to be leaders in making an impact on modern slavery. I'm here today with Heather Moore from the Salvation Army. Welcome, Heather. It's good to have you here.
Nice to see you.
Thank you. I'll introduce Heather properly in a moment, but as always, I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country, recognising that people are joining us from many parts, even outside Australia. And today I'll be speaking from Workerled country, upon which the northern parts of Sydney are. Hi, Jasmine. I'm just going to put you on. I'm just going to unmute. Put you on stop video. Okay, sorry. Oh, that's me. Actually, if you can turn off your video. Sorry, that's perfect. Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'd like to acknowledge, coming from Workerled country, upon which the northern parts of Sydney are. And my guest today, Heather, is speaking from Ngambri and Ngambri country, upon which Canberra is based. So in the spirit of reconciliation, Unchained acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. And we pay our respect to elders past, present, and extend all that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So we host these webinars with a view to advancing the conversation on the issue of modern slavery, and we really want to help companies and organisations to go deeper as they implement the Modern Slavery Act. You may be here today representing a particular organisation, or you actually may be just, well, not just, but an amazing citizen and someone who's interested in this issue. So we want to use this forum also to assist you and help you. And at the end of this webinar, we'll give you an opportunity, contact details, and you're very much free to connect with Heather and myself. We work for different organizations, obviously, if you want to explore more the issues and want to learn more. So I want to thank you for joining us. And and also in this process, we also invite you to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And what we'll do is we'll run the interview, my conversation with Heather, and then we'll give time at the end for you to address those questions. And if we don't, we'll address them in writing. Depends how dynamic the conversation is and how involved we get, which I'm sure it will be very dynamic. So if we do get carried away, we apologize in advance, and we'll respond to those questions in due course. So Heather, welcome. I'd like, please, you're probably the best person to introduce yourself. So if you could perhaps, talk about who you are and what's your role in this space called modern slavery intervention.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Stephen. And I also add my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of Canberra and acknowledge their ongoing connection to land and waters across Australia. I have been working on the issue of modern slavery for couple of decades now. I'm originally from the United States and started in this work. I'm actually a social worker by training, and started this journey as a manager for starting a safe house for survivors of trafficking and slavery in Los Angeles. And over the course of my last couple of decades, have just sort of moved across into policy and advocacy work, but always very much relying on that firsthand experience of working with survivors and really understanding the impacts of this crime on individuals. I started the Salvation Army close to 7 years ago in a policy and advocacy role, and participated extensively in lobbying for the Modern Slavery Act, and have been since then looking at corporate reporting, corporate performance under the Act, with a particular interest in the effectiveness criterion. Mm-hmm. And so as you know, I've been doing a lot of research over the last couple of years, looking at how to support business to understand what does effectiveness mean in this space, how do we measure it, and how do we inform policymakers so that the law is providing appropriate prompts to drive business behavior toward really meaningful and successful action on slavery and supply chain.
Wow, that's yeah, I mean, you're doing important work, and we've had lots of conversations so far about all that kind of work. And I suppose, yeah, you've obviously had a bit of a windy journey, and you've ended up in Australia. And obviously the issues exist in North America. Do you see any difference, I suppose, in terms of the response from governments and corporates to this issue between the two countries?
Yeah, there's a lot of differences. I mean, fairly significant differences. And there are, I think each country has its advantages. I guess focusing on the modern slavery and the supply chain side of things, Australia probably has, well, some people may disagree with this, but I guess I'm a believer in broad, consistent approaches that make it easier. Like, I'm all about making it easier for a business to get on board.
Right.
And I think, having a national consistent legislative framework to drive business action on slavery and supply chains and other human rights, all violations in supply chains, is a useful approach. So I think in that space, Australia having the Modern Slavery Act is a really good, it's a good mechanism to get business started. The US, I think, has the advantage of having, I think the government in the United States probably assumes a little bit more responsibility in this, particularly with regard, like, for example, the US Department of Labor publishes, as you would know, obviously, a high-risk goods, an annual list of goods made with forced labor, and that, I guess, it sort of it achieves some efficiencies for business in terms of you don't have everybody having to do their own research and due diligence. You can sort of draw, so newcomers to the space can actually really rely on that kind of resource to help them know where to start.
Yep.
And reflect on where their own risk might be, as opposed to starting from scratch. And then I think obviously the other major advantage in the US is you have the Tariff Act, which provides a mechanism for customs officials to withhold imports that where there's reasonable suspicion that they've been made with forced labor, and a reverse onus on the importer to prove that those goods are actually clean. So I think so even as far back as when we were lobbying for the Modern Slavery Act, we were calling on government to establish these kinds of mechanisms. And I think we're getting closer. There is a bill before the Parliament. It doesn't have a mechanism. It's just sort of an aspiration, but we got to start with something.
Sure.
So look, I think it's going to be a really interesting space in the next couple of years to see what happens with the Modern Slavery Act review, what happens with this bill. Labor's said that they will advance an import ban mechanism. So if Labor wins the election, I think we're in good shape there. But the current government hasn't ruled it out either. So we'll definitely be focusing on that moving forward.
Sure, great. Well, we'll skip back into talking about the legislation soon. I just want to to maybe come back, peel back to more of your personal engagement with this issue. I mean, I often get asked, how did you get involved in this space? How did you come into contact with modern slavery? Or at that time, it was just human trafficking back in the early noughties. There's a sense in which I come from a religious background that's as a community leader, as a pastor, and that was my entry into this. And you've come into it as a social worker. So did your social work begin with a focus on this issue, or were you working focusing on other issues and then sort of discovered or fell? I don't know. How do you? Yeah, got it.
Yeah. Oh no, I definitely think I was actually, I've always, my mother was an ESL teacher, and, I grew up, I didn't grow up in a particularly diverse community, but because of my mother's work, was exposed to lots of different cultures. And I always loved just learning from other people and other cultures and learning how other people live and see the world. And so I naturally gravitated to work with migrants and in particularly refugee communities. But I finished my social work degree, focused on international social welfare, and found this job. Can I come and work in Los Angeles, help us set up a shelter? It was the first shelter for trafficked women in the United States.
Yep.
And it really, I've never been able to really leave the field. It's just such an interesting dynamic space where you can do a lot of good.
Yeah.
So I very much was, as you say, sort of fell. It wasn't something that I knew from an early age that I wanted to do. In fact, like most people back then, I was like, is this still a thing?
Right.
So, it certainly found me.
Yeah, and I think that's probably my experience too. I think the issue found me. I think, as my wife and I, we did a lot initial work in Spain, and there were so many times we just wanted to go, oh, we just can't do this anymore. We can't do this anymore. Like I can't do this anymore. And then it just has this, I'm drawn. My conviction over time, over the last 10, 12 years has just grown, and I just can't now escape. Except the issue. And I mentioned that just because I know there's a lot of people out there who, who look at this issue from a distance and think, oh, well, what can I do? How can I get involved? And I know for me, often it's like, well, just start getting involved, start reading, start volunteering, just start participating in all the levels of intervention that are out there. And as you said, there's a multitude of opportunities out there for people to get engaged in this issue. Okay, so I suppose when it does come to modern slavery risk and addressing it, what are you most passionate about when it comes to this space?
So in terms of modern slavery risk?
Well, in terms of addressing this issue, the issue of modern slavery and, big picture.
Yeah, well, I guess just taking a step back to what we were just talking about, it might help for me to sort of share sort of my lens on through all of this as a social worker. And I should say, for the Australians and the social work education is quite different in the United States. It's quite clinical here and focused heavily on just like sort of direct client work. But my studies focus much more on systemic and structural change.
Okay.
And also program development and evaluation.
Okay.
And so I guess what I've always looked at, modern slavery is this kind of, I'm sure this won't be a surprise to many in the audience, that I think modern slavery is not a particularly scrutinized area of policy. And that's because I think most people think, oh, well, anything that is supposed to fight modern slavery must be good.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always applied, I guess, from my professional lens, my interest is in pushing the thinking to a more strategic and critical level, and actually interrogating whether the assumptions that are underpinning the action, the policy, the program, are actually going to work. And because we do a lot of stuff, if you actually look globally at the amount of money that's been thrown at this problem, and then you compare it to the results, you look at the prosecution rate globally, even modern slavery reporting quality thus far under the UK and under Australia now. You kind of have to wonder whether or not we're throwing our money at the right thing. And so I guess that's the role that I always try to play, is how can I help people, be it police, law enforcement, prosecutors, companies, nonprofits, whoever, to challenge the assumptions that they're making about whatever action they're taking is actually going to achieve. Because, evaluation tells us, there are a lot of why projects fail. A lot of projects fail because of poor implementation or insufficient resourcing, but actually a lot of projects fail because they were faulty to begin with. And that it doesn't matter how well you do one thing, if that one thing isn't actually going to address the problem, then you're just wasting time and money. And I think we see that a lot in the modern slavery reporting space, is a lot of companies want to offset their risk. And so they bring in extremely expensive consultancies. And I'm not here to bash the consultancies. I'm just saying that there are ways to achieve, audits actually is a really good example. We all know, the limitations of social audits, which has become quite an industry in and of itself. And we've seen in the rubber gloves industry, the fractures, the deep flaws in social audits, third-party audits, where companies were receiving top ratings, where forced labor was still actually occurring in their supply chain. So my passion, I guess, Stephen, is very much about helping people identify what works. And in order to do that, I guess reimagining how, I've got cats are along from our ride here today. I've got my webinar passengers.
But it's had a cat's tail, but yes.
Yeah, one of my cats met a minister last week. He was very gracious about it. So. It was pretty funny. But also, in order to understand what works, you need to understand the lived experience of the people most directly impacted by the problem. And that's where I think the victim services expertise can help business and government, is understanding this problem beyond an abstraction. That we're actually talking about human beings here. And you cannot conceptualize a proper response until you understand this problem from the position of the worker and the vulnerable person.
No, and I agree. And I think one of our, I've been in lots of parts of the world where there's issues of poverty and exploitation. I think a lot of people would do well to just, the next time they go to, Bali, for example, don't go to Bali, go to, Sulawesi, or go to Banda Aceh, or just go somewhere where you can actually get a feel and a sense of actually how people are living in different contexts, and where and what are the real drivers behind exploitation, and go to kind of experience, trying to plug into actually real experiences where it's appropriate. So. That's great. Now that's really, I suppose then, you've some of the work you've been doing, the research you're doing is around what are we measuring? How do we measure the effectiveness of what we're doing? And I know in a paper there's been a lot of emphasis that you've mentioned around process. So there's as you said, there's lots of activities, lots of tools out there, lots of money being spent, and then people measuring sort of the effectiveness of those, or somehow trying to measure the effectiveness of those tools. And you mentioned talking about, well, how do we shift the focus from process to outcomes, or to and measuring, and actually giving more of a attention to the context of what we're actually measuring. Can maybe unpack that a little bit more succinctly, more professionally than than I have? That would be great.
Absolutely. Look, so there's an organization called Shift Project, and they embarked on a really fascinating research project a couple of years ago, where they basically did a complete review of all of the S indicators out there across. I think they identified, close to 400. I think it was 400 different reporting instruments, corporate human rights reporting instruments. And they looked at the S indicators, and what they found was, I think it was something like over 70% were process-based. So what we're doing, okay, and to get that really specific, it's, well, we introduced a contract clause, we introduced a code of conduct, we updated our code of conduct, we did training, we had all of our suppliers conduct self-assessment questionnaires, we joined a network or a community of practice. And that's all good. And you need to do all of that. But that's not the end. That's the means to an end.
Yes.
And so I think when we talk about race to the top versus race to the middle, that's the middle. And what people need is guidance on how to go further and actually articulate, what do I expect to change as a result of all these things? And so what when we talk about moving from process to outcome, it's about, well, not what did you do, but what did you achieve? And the reporting under the first two cycles of reporting under the Modern Slavery Act are demonstrating that we've got a really long way to go. And that's okay. It's not good. Like, solid change takes time.
Yep.
But it's about making sure that we keep our eye on that prize and looking at, where we want to be in 5 years, and moving beyond thinking about managing risk through contracts and shifting our attention over time towards conditions. And then how do I break down the barriers that prevent me from accessing that? Obviously, one of the common concerns we hear from businesses, well, I don't have any visibility beyond tier 2, some tier 1.
Yes.
And so how do you do that? And so I was just reading yesterday that Ansel the head of Ansel was basically saying, after this latest import ban in the US, that they're actually seriously considering taking everything in-house. Telstra's done very similar work. I'm aware of, Asset Links, a cleaning company in Australia. They've been a leader in this space for a few years now, and they are actually proud to say that they hire all their cleaners directly. And that's how, yes, it might be a little more expensive for them, but in the long run, the upfront more expensive, but in the long run, they're saving money and time by not, sort of faffing around, to use Aussie slang here, with middlemen that are, that are often the problem. Often causing the problem.
From what I can see, then the immediate impact of that is then you need to expand your operations, really, in some respects. You think so? If you're going to manage everything directly and not outsource and go through, subcontracting, and you want to control things, then that has an impact on your actual. I suppose it would have an impact on your budget and what you can do.
And I'm not saying that you can't do third-party hiring or third-party recruiting. You can do it ethically. It can be done. So I'm not suggesting that everybody should just suddenly start direct hiring. That's impossible for some of the more complex, like even for the Salvation Army, there's thousands and thousands of suppliers across the organization. So it's not, I'm not saying, I don't want anyone to think that I'm proposing some simplistic response here. But that's really what I'm trying to do in the research that I'm starting, is looking at how do you bring people together in a non-competitive, safe space to leverage the expertise of business, of investors, of of not-for-profits, of victim service providers,
Yeah.
to inform the steps and really, and also identify the aim, right? Because the research that I did with Monash a couple of years ago very much, found that, if you're only setting your sights
so far,
that's very much limiting how far you can really go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as someone, in the space as a consultant, dealing with a range of clients and a multitude of responses, there is a tremendous amount of work that's been done and some good, what I call layering of the croissant, if you like. So good foundations, and some are even struggling to do that. So even just the initial investment to put down the first layer to work out how ready they are to comply to begin with, and then to start mapping the value chain and working out, well, who are all the key stakeholders in this, and how do we, where does risk lie? For some, that's even just getting to that place is a struggle. So, so I suppose how can, I suppose from your perspective, how can, say, government, for example, be doing more to support business and organizations to get this done, to implement the Act?
Yeah. Well, as I said before, I think achieving some efficiencies through government-led research and due diligence, which arguably they would be doing anyway for the Commonwealth Consolidated Statement, would be a really important step. Mm-hmm. Making import data public, and also so that people can make more informed decisions and just enable. It can often be difficult to connect something from that's in Australia to, it's very difficult to map it back to the specific source, factory or farm or whatever overseas. But I think the question of the issue of the forced labor, alleged forced labor of alleged, some would say confirmed forced labor of ethnic minorities in Xinjiang and other parts of China, I think is really probably the curliest part of this problem. Is that because you've got somebody did some reviews of statements that found that where we know companies are sourcing from China, and in the reports they either downplay the risk or don't acknowledge the risk at all.
Okay.
And so I guess at some point somebody needs to decide, we don't want forced labor imports coming into our country, because you can't really argue that any one business is going to have any kind of leverage to change those conditions overseas, in a place like China, or frankly any country where there's state sanctioned forced labor. And so there is a clear role for government in this. You can't just dump it all on business. No. There has to be a collaborative approach to this kind of problem. It's just too complex for any one type of organization. Plus, frankly, I guess, get a little bit on my high horse. I just don't think that the issue of forced labor should be left to the market. So it can't be put on the consumer either.
Right.
As a conscious consumer, it is extremely difficult.
Well, I think yes.
to purchase, I was trying to buy a dining table a couple of years ago, and everywhere I went, they were like, "Oh, this is great. This is from Vietnam, and it's so cheap." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know your audience. That's actually not the table I want." Well, And I ended up going to an Australian, a small business in Australia that both had full supply chain transparency, both in terms of logging as well as labor. But I paid a pretty penny, and obviously not all consumers can afford to do that. So,
well, that's the thing, and that's the
clear role for government.
For at times, I feel like it's a full-time job. to be responsible as in sourcing. It's a,
yeah.
People often ask me, so where do you begin? I say, well, I think you actually need to come up with a strategy. I think you need to start in the kitchen and work outwards, like I think pick a room in your house and open your pantry and start there, or open your wardrobe and start there, like I think you can't, that's just the tension. It's like, it's a full-time job. And as you say, not everyone can afford that, but as some others would say, well, we shouldn't need to make things more expensive.
I completely agree with that. Yeah.
So, okay. I suppose just in terms of one of the tensions, and sorry if I haven't sort of primed you for this question, but I suppose one of the tensions then for Australian organisations is that they might then map out do the process of mapping out the supply chain and realise, oh well, there's the risk in Australia is low. And there's obviously some ambiguity about really what that means. From where I sit, I think there is ambiguity in what actually the reality of modern slavery is in Australia, and that becomes a big conversation piece with some of my clients. It's like, well, how do we make sense of, two sets of data, one from the Australian Institute of Criminology and the one from Global Slavery Index, and then 1 in 5 cases are reported. And your question, when we talked a couple of weeks ago, as well, that's really the conversation, isn't it? So why is it only that 1 in 5 cases are reported? What do you think we could do in Australia to kind of push through this ambiguity around risk in Australia? Because it's kind of, there's some stats and then there's lots of anecdotal information, but there's obviously that creates a tension, because I think when companies, from my perspective, when companies just say, oh, well, the risk in Australia is low, that could actually then cloud the issue, because they might just then, the tendency, I suppose the temptation is then to just race to the middle. Oh, well, it's the risk here is low, and there's not much you can do.
Well, I think the starting point for business when considering the potential extent of risk within the Australian domestic context is not. So let me just take a step back. So you pointed out the different figures, right? So it's important for people to understand that both the two estimates were derived from very different methodologies. And the Australian Institute of Criminology statistic, which it looked at 2 financial years specifically, and it drew on several data points, including the Salvation Army. We were one of the data sources for that, and you sort of look across different points, and you sort of have to, where you don't have clear and consistent data, you have to rule out certain data sets. So I think, it should be of grave concern to everyone that for every 1 victim identified in Australia, 4 go unidentified. That should scare people, because it's really about, it's not, I just think I would encourage business to look, who've got, strong, extensive supply chains within Australia, to be thinking of this in terms of what I don't know. The risk really is in what you don't know and what you can't see. It could be more. We don't know. Statistics are notoriously difficult in this space. And everybody who's generating the statistics is quite upfront about that, right? So I guess the other thing is, if you are operating in a high-risk industry, you only need one bad news story to bear the brunt of this, right? So I don't think it's particularly wise to assume you don't have any risk because the national estimate thinks that there might be about 2,000 people in slavery in Australia. I just don't, I think we need to take a much more humanistic approach to this, because I think most people would agree one slave is one slave too many.
Yeah, exactly.
And if your business operations are vulnerable to this, or worse, contributing to this, that should be a concern. So I think, I would encourage people not to fuss too much about statistics because they're highly unreliable, because this is such a difficult crime to uncover.
Yeah.
You know, you've got people standing right in front of you who will tell you to your face, I'm fine. And that's because just around the corner, they've got somebody threatening their family members back home, threatening their entire livelihood.
Yep.
And we can't make assumptions that other people who live in have the very different experience of the world and of justice and rule of law,
yeah, to
act in the way that we would if we were in that situation. So it is incredibly difficult to identify. And you know, I just think we shouldn't get too caught up in the statistics, and we shouldn't get too caught up in whether there's, obviously you need risk, you need to have some direction. Yes. But I think further to that point, you can spend a lot of time just assessing your risk when that money would be better spent just getting on with it and taking action to deal with the potential problem.
Okay. Yep. Good. That's good. Well, I suppose just on that then, if you know, if a large corporation wanted to invest, say $10 million, if someone came to you with $10 million, they want to invest $10 million into this issue, how would you advise them?
My first inclination is to say you don't need that much. I think that's what everybody thinks, is that, I mean, I'd love to see somebody invest that kind of money into the problem, but I guess the message that I'm trying to send is that this doesn't have to cost that much money.
Yep.
We engaged 3 other organizations to fund a local NGO in India to go and do some shadow research for a brain company that we know was supplying from that factory, or these 2 sites in India. And that these 2 sites have been subject to social audits, which came back completely clean. And so for 10,000 Australian dollars, we actually generated a genuine report where 100% of the workers were interviewed, and we discovered not forced labor, but excessive overtime, sexual harassment, and some pay conditions, pay issues.
Yeah.
$10,000. Now, you can't replicate that perfectly everywhere, right? So again, now I'm not suggesting that this is all simple and easy, but I'm using that as an example to say that you can actually throw your money at all sorts of things to sort of for cover.
Yes.
And still end up in the headlines. And so I think this is really where companies need to shift away from compliance and cover to actually achieving some meaningful change. And that doesn't have to cost it. I mean, you know, it depends on the size of the company. You know, if you're, I don't want to name any companies, but maybe there are some very major ASX 100 companies that maybe they should be looking at, you know, a few $1 million at the problem. But to answer your question, Stephen, I think the first place that I would start is mapping and drilling down and getting that visibility. Shortening where you can, shortening the supply chain where you can, mm-hmm. and understanding the context, doing research. So partnering with local NGOs that have the trust of workers, partner with reliable academic institutions who are experienced in field research with vulnerable populations, mm-hmm. because you have, you know, if you start with the will to find, and that's necessary for anything to be effective, you actually have to want to find it.
Yes.
Traditional supply chain assurance practices are not going to find it. So you need to find other ways to get information. And I think fundamental to that is to stop looking at workers as some latent part of your supply chain, and regard them more as key points of really good information, And because they have the information, they know what's going on.
Yes.
And so I think a lot of companies are missing out on that. Is they're looking at workers, I mean, it's broader, you would know from your research, the broader human trafficking global sector often, regards as victims as sort of passive individuals just waiting to be rescued. And there is some risk of that creeping into the space. So we need to be looking at workers as key stakeholders who can contribute to understanding the problem, developing meaningful solutions, and breaking the cycle of exploitation, so that we develop new strategies, new business strategies for that lift working conditions, but also, frankly, build more resilient supply chains.
Okay. Yep. I mean, I could think of 10 million. I could think of many ways to spend the $10 million, but
you caught me off guard there. You need time to work out a budget, but I think understanding the problem is really important.
Yeah.
You don't understand the problem if you don't define the problem properly from the beginning. You cannot actually generate solutions that are going to address the problem.
Yeah. I mean, $10 million obviously, could be put into funding research, funding salaries to do the research, obviously. And then, I think of obviously the role of technology and developing technologies to assist in the efforts. But
yeah, I'm a technology skeptic. I'm a tech skeptic. There's clearly a role, but I think it was a great article published a couple of years back in the British Journal that looked at worker feedback technologies, and they found that they were not very successful in detecting.
Okay.
And that workers didn't trust them, that workers didn't necessarily use them, and that they shouldn't be. I think the greatest risk that I see with technology is that it's just it can be used as another form of cover, instead of actually taking action that effectively rebalances power in the employment relationship down into the supply chain.
Okay. So, I mean, what, just I suppose to pull it together, what sort of, we've talked about, yes, it's important to lay the foundations, to map, to drill down, not use different tools and processes to cover up, or as a foil for that we're doing something significant. So, how can companies, I suppose, practically go further, go the extra mile, to find what they're looking for?
Well, I think, sorry.
I mean, do we need more teams? Do we need more people to travel? To actually go and investigate personally, for example, what's going on? Yeah.
Look, I think I'm hesitating because I think it will probably be different depending on the supply chain. It'll be different for different companies. So I don't think there's a one size fits all answer here, but I guess at the risk of repeating myself, I think there's enough information out there to have a pretty good idea where your risk is. And I think we need to just sort of get on with it and start moving into actually understanding, knowing the supply chain, and finding ways to directly engage as much as possible with workers themselves. And I do think it requires more boots on the ground, to use your words, being more hands-on. I also think a lot of it depends, sort of the action depends on where the responsibility is positioned within a company. And I've seen a lot of this. I'm not a lawyer, but a lawyer did say to me that it's a real problem when this sits with the lawyers. So I'm sorry to any lawyers on the call. But this lawyer was reflecting to me that as soon as it sits within legal and compliance, it fundamentally shapes how a company thinks about the problem.
Right.
Company, commercial and non-commercial, right? So this, because most of the Australian Act applies to commercial and non-commercial entities. So when I say company, I'm using that for entities, really all of the reporting entities out there. And I think a lot depends on the more successful companies, you see a real culture from the top. So board members and MDs and CEOs like Dr. David Cook, who really lead it from a cultural perspective, and that trickle down effect. And then the next step is translating that aspiration into a budget priority. So I see a lot of organizations that get the talk right and the aspiration right, but they haven't necessarily committed the appropriate resources to the problem.
Okay.
And then the next step is to make sure that you've got a cross-functional team that's got responsibility, and that the person leading that team has a clear and resourced mandate to find the problem. And so I said a second ago, sort of in passing, you have to want to find it.
Yep.
I think a lot of people don't want to find it. And this is probably where, I am definitely a purport. I'm not a Modern Slavery Act cynic. I think it's done a lot of good. I think it still has a lot, we've got a lot of fuel to get out of that tank.
Yes.
But I think as we look at the review, we need to look at how to drive better quality reporting. And I'm not convinced that penalties will do that. I think penalties will lift compliance marginally and will capture the people who aren't actually issuing a statement. But what we really need now is to push companies to go that next step beyond process. In terms of how you actually do that out into the supply chain, I'm still learning that myself. And this is why I'm seeking to, speak with as many businesses as I can, doing this research. Yep. To look at how do we make this feasible within highly complex, diverse markets and systems, supply chain.
Yep. Great. Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, very long-winded answer to your question.
No, but it's important. I think it's like I really appreciate wrestling with that. And I think what you indicate is that it is, there's a lot to wrestle with, and that's the desire and the, I suppose, the investment needs to be there to wrestle with the issues and wrestle with the complexities, at various levels. So I think that's part of the investment that needs to occur is moving beyond the process, as you said, is to actually not be satisfied with the results that you're getting. And
I think just a further thought on this as you're speaking, I think we use the term partialize in the social work field. You don't bite off more than you can chew. So find a logical place to start, map that. And then, companies can look at setting up worker boards or, worker-led. This really is the foundations of worker-led social responsibility. And there's some programs out there that companies can look at, like the Fair Food Program in Florida is regarded as one of the most successful programs in the world, where we, had year after year after year of human trafficking prosecutions in the farm sector in Florida. And small organization comprised mostly of workers, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, CIW, started working with farmers, didn't get any traction, went to major retailers. There was a massive boycott of some of these big companies, Taco Bell, Burger King and whatnot, Costco, some of the supermarkets. And finally, the combined force of the pressure of the prosecutions, the risk that the government was bringing of the risk of prosecution. And we've talked about the role of government here before. This is one, combined with market pressure from consumers and from the workers, culminated in some pretty significant sustained change that has seen the reduction of almost immediate reduction of human trafficking prosecutions in that area, at least before the Trump administration came in. Sorry, well, I won't get political here, but let's be honest. Things changed in 2016.
In the Trump
anyway,
years, right?
So I think I guess the lesson here for people is you don't have to start from scratch. Nope. There are lots of resources. Verite has a responsible sourcing toolkit, responsible recruitment. The ILO has lots of resources. Companies don't have to reinvent the wheel here or start from zero. There's a lot that people can use to start. And then the last thing I would say is working with victim service providers who can help, who can at least be trade unions. God forbid I say the word trade union. Talking to workers, talking to people who understand from firsthand experience working. If you can't get to workers or victims immediately, talk to trusted proxies or people like the Salvation Army. We've got a survivor leadership program where we are able to connect. We're not working on government right now, but there's potential to expand that so that business can be speaking with survivors of slavery and supply chains directly, so that they can understand what the causes of the problem are.
We've got about 10 minutes to go, and we've got a couple of questions, at least one question, and it's quite a long one, so I might just have to read it out and then see how it lands. How to develop meaningful changes in countries where simply funding NGOs would not bring about change due to a restrictive political environment. Generally, it seems more authoritarian countries have more instances of exploited workers, people, but are simply silenced. I'll just unpack that.
Yeah, look, I mean, that's a really good question. And we could probably talk about that for another hour.
Right.
We
could respond to that in an email.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, I do think we could say briefly that you can, I'm not sure if the questioner is talking about, but the question raises the idea of funding NGOs. So I'm not suggesting necessarily that companies have to go out and fund NGOs. I'm suggesting that you find an NGO who you can trust. And I realize that that's difficult, and we can talk more about how you might do that offline. But finding an NGO that does good work, that practices a human rights approach, not a rescue or a cowboy approach. There's lots of cowboy NGOs, particularly across Southeast Asia. And work with them to understand your context. Work with them to do some mapping, to understand some of the contextual drivers in the community that frankly may sit outside of your sphere of influence.
Yep, sure. Yeah.
Nestle's cocoa plan is actually really interesting. They just made an announcement at the beginning of February where they're actually going to be paying farmers to keep kids in school. And if you look at how Nestle's work in Cote d'Ivoire has, in West Africa, where there's significant rates of corruption, how that's evolved over the years, it's actually quite impressive. Because what they've done is they've cut out middle operators, and they have developed trust with people on the ground, and they've mapped. So they almost know the people. Yeah. Down to the last kid. And they've got programs around getting kids back into school if they've left. So they've sort of taken a community development approach. So that's one way that people can do it in a way that, and they are partnered with an NGO on the ground. But Margaret Stewart could probably provide much better information about how they actually went about doing that.
Yeah, and I suppose that just raises another layer of the mapping process. Because mapping can often be, again, a process that's done on a computer, on a system, but actually to do mapping in a more social way, in a more tangible way, where actually you get to know the key actors. You interface with those who are on the ground, who actually understand where the risks are. That takes risk assessment to a whole different level.
Yeah.
Which is an exciting vision. It's great, and it's great to see that Nestle has been able to, over the, and that takes time as well. I think that what that says to me is that Nestle have been working on this for quite a number of years. So it actually, that is not a short-term vision. That's not a short-term project. That's actually a commitment and a long-term investment to going to moving just beyond processes that happen in some office tower in some big city. So great. Well, look, we're coming to the end of our webinar, and I think, just as we've been talking, just some key takeaways for me, and there could be more, but, obviously having, coming back to having a clear purpose and a clear strategy that has a long-term view of what is it that we want to achieve. I think that is a key point that Heather's raised today. And I think next to that is really, yes, absolutely, do the processes, do those more high-level processes, get the foundations for due diligence in place, but then actually to, not be satisfied with just measuring those processes, but to, find ways to go deeper and to get the information that you need. And in that, you don't need to reinvent the wheel, that there's lots of resources and there's lots of actors and players on the ground to connect with. And obviously that's that process then requires, that's where the investment is, I think, is actually, if you've got $10 million, maybe that's that's where you need to invest. And I'm sure Nestle has
set up my new NGO with $10 million.
Exactly. I'm sure Nestle has got, has invested more than $10 million in this process. So I wouldn't know, but I think that's where the investment is, to actually get the understanding and to really understand the issues. Because because I think, as you said, look, I'm not completely sold on technology in this space. I'm not a tech person at all, and I sit in the soft social space. So I would naturally gravitate to a more collaborative, social, conversational approach of developing trust with the respective key stakeholders, which is certainly the approach that we take at Unchained. So I think, that seems to be probably a summary, really, of what we've spoken to today. And I really want to thank you again, Heather, for joining me on this conversation. Sorry if I threw a few questions out there that you weren't that threw off guard, but
just the $10 million caught me out. But
I had that down. I thought I'd sort of primed you for that conversation, that question. Anyway.
I must have missed it, but it's okay. I like surprises. It's all good.
I really want to thank you for your time today and for your insights. And I know that for those who've joined us, that it's been a great, very, very insightful. And I've taken a lot away from myself and based on those keynotes. If you've got any more questions, we welcome you to put them forward, and you can do that by communicating or getting in contact with us. Just get Brianna to put up that slide if that's possible. Here we go. Perfect. So if you want to connect with Heather, you can email her at the Salvation Army. And if you want to connect with me, you can do so in a very COVID-related way. I've got a QR code that you can scan, and that will connect you to all the different channels that I'm on. So look, we do welcome your feedback and your questions, and we do thank you that you've been able to join us. And we just hope that today's conversation has been helpful for you in wherever you are. If you're in business, I don't know if you're an executive or in management, or you're a conscious consumer, or you're someone even in politics perhaps, or maybe even a lawyer, and we hope that you weren't put off today by that, because we think law has a very significant role to play. But we want to think we do want to thank you for joining us, and we do wish you well. And we hope you can join us next month for our next webinar. So thank you.
Thank you.